when participation from us is threatened, we could bring down the system, because the moment we stop acting as economic units, the moment we look to each other and say, do we need this system to look after each other, then we threaten the core of the capitalist project. And this is what's happening with Palestine. Is the problem with Palestine is that the narrative is unraveling.
Welcome back to The Tea, the show where we dive into the story behind the stories. I'm your host, Myriam Francois. Before we get into this episode, I just want to take a tiny moment to ask you to do one thing for me, and that is to hit that subscribe button now. We're a small independent team, no big networks here, no corporate backing, just a handful of people who care deeply about having honest conversations and shining a light on what often goes unseen or unheard. So if our work does resonate with you too, then subscribe now on YouTube and join us on Patreon, link in our bio. There's something in the air right now. Many people, young and not so young, are asking deeper questions about what is going wrong in the world around us. Falling living standards across the West, rising authoritarianism, increasing wars, and a sense of a lack of political accountability of our leaders. I think we're all wondering not just about what's broken, but why it is and what it takes to truly change it. From the classroom to the picket line, from Palestine to policing, we're seeing cracks in the system and people reaching for something bigger than reform. Liberation? But what does that really mean? What does decolonization look like beyond hashtags and curriculum panels? And how do we navigate the co-opting of radical language in a world where everyone's anti-racist and doing the work until it costs us something? My guest this week is someone who's been wrestling with these questions, not just in theory, but in community, in struggle, and in spirit. You might know him from his Instagram reels, calling us all to lean into discomfort, decenter the West, and free our minds. Hasanain Jaffer is a student of decolonial thought with roots in Islamic philosophy, grassroots organizing, and a deep commitment to dismantling systems of whiteness and empire. He's been a trustee in his local Muslim community, worked on refugee sponsorship, basic income, and now he's digging into how education itself might be part of the problem. If you've ever wondered what a post-imperial politics could look like, this episode is for you. Hasanain, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. Pleasure to have you with us. Over the past year, I've obviously watched you on Instagram many times, sharing thoughts, usually from your car, I think it is, reminding us of many of the sort of theoretical lessons that help us make sense of the day-to-day horrors that we're witnessing at multiple levels. If you could distill the core message that you've been sharing across various platforms over the last 18 months or more, what would you say that is?
That's a big question. I think the core of what I'm always trying to get to is that for us as Westerners residing in the West, who are not at the front end, at the sharp end of the global systems of oppression, our job is to raise consciousness and to organize. Like, if you had to distill it, that's where it would go. That's what we need to be doing.
And you talk a lot about organizing in community and the importance of community. And I suppose we are seeing a lot of this political awakening happening around Palestine. And it's driven by, I suppose, the awakening of different intersecting communities at this particular point in time. As someone who's both, a community organizer and a decolonial thinker, what is the place of community in political organizing?
Yeah, I mean, the harder question is what is community at all? Like, I think we have this perception that community is when you do something for somebody, somebody does something for you, and you're in community in some way, this reciprocal relationship. And there's some truth to that, right? Because one of the most insidious effects of racial capitalism is that it's turned our relationships with each other transactional. So what used to be much more collaborative relationships have become transactional. So community is about changing those relationships between individuals from transactional to more caring, compassionate, loving relationships. But it's not just about that, because you can build a community and it can be quite siloed, especially for us, like middle-class Westerners who have their basic needs met. For us to go and look after each other and make sure our needs are met, it's not really going to have an impact on a world stage. It's not really battling the systems of oppression. So when we talk about community, what I'm talking about is finding the most vulnerable people that you have access to. I'm talking about the homeless. I'm talking about disabled people. I'm talking about elderly people, and finding what you can do for them and what they can do for you. That's truly building community. But I think the lack of that means we fracture our ability to build power in any way, whether it's to serve each other or whether it's to change global systems of oppression. So those are the connections I'm sort of trying to make.
And obviously, you know a thing or two about being a carer in the community because you're a carer to your son, Ahmed, who has disabilities.
Yeah.
And we are talking today at a time where the government here in the UK, which is a Labour government, for those who are not aware, have brought in very significant cuts to disability benefits. Up to 1.2 million people could lose that disability help by 2029, which means just as many carers could lose their carers allowance, which is obviously a huge loss because already many carers are living in poverty, and some of them are also themselves struggling with disabilities. So as someone who is yourself a carer, beyond obviously the impact I've just described of these cuts, what message do these cuts send to us all about the value of disabled people in our community? And what does resisting those cuts actually look like and mean?
So I wrote carer when I write about Ahmed, and my wife said to me, "It's weird that you call yourself a carer. You're a father." So maybe I should frame it as this: as like, I'm a father to Ahmed, and the cuts, as much as everything else that we've been fighting to get for Ahmed, like, you know, the chronic lack of social care, the problems we have with getting therapists, getting good school placement, the fact that parents of children with special needs have to fight constantly to gain an inch, you know, in any scenario. I think it reflects a wider global system, right? So, like, you can imagine a community setting in which our primary responsibility is to care for those who need it most. Children with disabilities, elderly people with disabilities, anybody who is unable to function in this world the way it's been built, right, which is in itself problematic, is going to become our priority. But the way that the global system of capitalism works is that each of us is only as valuable as we are an economic unit. This is how the world has been structured. And so when we look at Ahmed, when we look at any person with disability, we see a problem that needs to be solved rather than what contribution is this person making, because it's not an economic contribution. And so, I mean, I'd like to just mention here what Ahmed has taught me is far more valuable than any university or any teacher, because he is the embodiment of resistance. Like, he doesn't care what anybody thinks. He doesn't care how he's viewed when he's shouting, when he's stimming, when he's doing his thing. But the value of that lesson is not recognized in the society we live in. So cuts can happen at the same time as a spaceship is launching in the US, and we're spending billions of dollars doing that, because there is no recognition that these people who are taking from you are the same people who are devaluing the people with disabilities and are able to cut their funding.
It's interesting that these cuts are also happening under a Labour government, which, for those who are obviously not from the UK, is supposed to be a left-wing government.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about the ways in which we are living in a time where, you know, we had Dr. Nafeez Ahmed on the show a couple of weeks ago, who was talking to us about sort of the ways in which neo-Nazi thinking, including forms of sort of eugenics, modern forms of eugenics-based thinking, continue to be prevalent in our societies and actually are perpetuated in new forms by a sort of new era of intellectuals, often in the tech sphere. And I was wondering whether you yourself make a connection between a society that does not see the value of elderly people, does not see the value of disabled people, and the fact that does not see the value of immigrants, even when we know that much of what's being built around us has been built off the back of immigrants, is linked somehow to an ideology that has deep roots here in the West, and in fact, you know, took hold not that long ago, right, in my grandparents' lifetime. The idea that there are people who are not just not valuable, but actually deserve to be exterminated because they are a burden on society.
Yeah, and I think I would go a bit further than that. Like, to me, the fact that this is happening under Labour government doesn't feel like a surprise. To me, the fact that Biden was in power when the genocide was happening in Palestine doesn't feel like a surprise, because I think the problem that we as residents in the Western world face is that we have also become brainwashed by modernity, by this colonial logic, this neoliberal logic that sort of is enmeshed in everything we undertake, right? And so if we zoom out a little bit and think of it slightly differently, when the world in which we operate doesn't have these anomalies of racism or these anomalies of ableism, these are actually a core part of the project of modernity. Like, these are built there by design. The dehumanization of people of color enables the movement of wealth from the imperial, from the periphery to the imperial core, right? Like, these are there by design. So Charles Mills has a great book called The Racial Contract, in which he discusses how the same, this eugenics we're talking about, the same scientists, philosophers at the time of the Enlightenment who came up with these ideas, they also set the stage for what we call the social contract, which is still how we operate today. So the social contract is how the government gives us rights, and in exchange, what do we give, how we interact with each other. These all form the social contract. But he argues that actually there was never a social contract that included non-white people. That's why he calls it the racial contract. But when we understand that the basis of the systems that we operate under, of our corporations, of our governments, of our nation states, is this logic, then it doesn't come as a surprise when people are dehumanized. It's always been there. It's not re-emerging. It never went away. So eugenics, the formal structures, the formal intellectual scaffolding of racism, like eugenics, like racial science, has been abolished. But racism never went away, because the oppression that continues to occur in the global south, which enables our prosperity here in the global north, never went away, and it has to continue.
So isn't that an argument to decolonize the centers or the former centers of empire, depending on how you look at these things? And obviously, over the last few years, we've seen significant investment into this idea of decolonizing the centers of empire. I myself was part of an initiative at SOAS to try and look at how you decolonize the university. SOAS obviously steeped in a colonial history. And, as somebody who studied decolonial movements, and anti-colonial movements first and decolonial movements after independence, what was always interesting to me was this idea that the former colonies had to undergo a process of decolonization where all their institutions had been forged by the colonizers, right? Their education system, their forms of government, even their borders, right? And so there's this new era of independence where people are sort of thinking, what does it look like to create our own state without the colonizers' influence? Now, I'm not saying it's succeeded in any or many situations,
Right.
but that was definitely a line of thought that anti-colonial thinkers and decolonial thinkers were operating under. But we never did the equivalent of that in the centers of empire, meaning we at the centers of empire were participants and drivers of the colonial project, of the empire project. But we never went through our own process of decolonizing how we think about the world in an equivalent fashion. And so I'm not surprised that we kind of sustain those going forward. So can we decolonize centers of empire in your view?
So we're not surprised that we sustain them, because it didn't happen by accident. It needs to be sustained in order for the global system to keep running. So let's look at this from the perspective of the university and then zoom out and think about it on a nation state level. The problem with decolonizing the university, and I was part of these sort of initiatives as well, when I look back on it, the problem is that the assumption we make when we go to decolonize a curriculum or decolonize a university is that there is a capacity for that decoloniality to occur. And the reality is that there is no capacity for it, because a university is built with certain presumptions, right? So on the level of knowledge, for example, there is a presumption about what kind of epistemology must be applied. What is correct knowledge? What is incorrect knowledge? How do we communicate that correct knowledge? My own journey into academia has been like a dilemma for me, because in writing, for example, about decolonial thought in a colonial institution, by accepting the premise that this is the only way to transmit correct knowledge. Like, think about what it does. What I'm saying is, the decolonial thought of my grandmother, who doesn't speak English, who never has written a paper or has learned how to do Harvard referencing, but is actually in her bones quite decolonial. She might not be able to articulate the thoughts of Frantz Fanon, but she does understand why white people are dangerous. Like, that is decoloniality. But our universities have erased all forms of indigenous wisdom, all forms of indigenous knowledge transmission, apart from the very restrictive white way of learning, right? Because they are part of the foundation of coloniality and of modernity. There is no capacity really to decolonize that. When we accept what the institution functions as and what it does and what it was built for, the only solution is actually to imagine outside of that institution. And the same applies to the nation state. The way in which the nation states have been structured, the way in which decolonization happened, it was a crisis for capitalism. In the 1960s, 50s, the decolonization movements in Africa, in the global south, were a crisis point for capitalism, but they found ways to ensure that neocolonialism, persists. They had to do that. So in the form of, debt, structural adjustments, assassinations of political leaders that were actually talking in a more socialist way. So these systems are not just persisting because we haven't addressed them. They're persisting because they need to. Otherwise, we risk the fall of global capitalism. And our nation states can't afford that.
So are you saying that even though obviously you yourself are studying for a master's now, that the master's tools can't dismantle the master's house, to paraphrase Audre Lorde?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And yeah, definitely my journey into, it's taken me a long time to come and do this master's, because I wasn't sure I wanted to do it.
Right.
Because I wasn't sure but I recognized the benefit of it. And we do this, right? We operate within the system. And what I've always tried to keep in mind while I'm doing this master's, is what I'm doing it for, why I'm doing it. And approaching anything, any political system, any initiative, like decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing SOAS, whatever it might be, but approaching it with the consciousness that this is a small part of what actually needs to happen. So we think about the movement around the statues, right? And the big protest, the Statue of Rhodes.
So Rhodes Must Fall was a campaign that was led, started in Oxford, to take down the statue of Cecil Rhodes, or I think it was actually a plaque dedicated to Cecil Rhodes, who had sponsored or spent a lot of money on sponsoring one of the colleges there, and students wanted to take it down because Cecil Rhodes was a key architect of South African apartheid.
Right. And, this isn't going to be the most popular opinion. That whole movement, I loved the vibe, right? Okay. I loved the energy that it created. I love the fact that people. But the question I asked myself is, what are we trying to do here? We remove a plaque of Rhodes. Why? So that more people of color are welcome into an institution that is essentially teaching us to be white. That is essentially teaching us that this is how you conduct yourself in a modern society, so that you can prosper at the expense of your homeland, of the African homeland from which we still rob today.
Okay,
right?
So I have a slight counter for you on this one. So if we think about anti-colonial movements, and you take something like the Algerian struggle for liberation, Abdelkader would be like a symbol of the indigenous people waging a liberation struggle on their own terms, right? Abdelkader led a jihad against the French as predominantly Muslim society, completely unintelligible to the French, right? They were just like, who is this barbarian on a horse?
Yeah.
Until today, right? A few Algerians travel to Paris, study in French universities, begin to express liberation in the language of the colonizers, not advocating for it, but that becomes suddenly intelligible. The Communist Party, right? They join the Communist Party and they start saying, hold on, aren't we your comrades? Don't we also deserve the same rights as other workers? And that begins a conversation in tandem to the struggle on the ground that opens up the potential for that conversation in French territory. Is there not value to also the kind of working on multiple fronts simultaneously? I guess is what I'm saying. Is there not value to those people who are still working to decolonize from within institutions?
There is value. Like, and I'm not going to say that we shouldn't be doing this work. The response that we have to have to the global system we live under is never going to feel adequate, right? Like, so there's always going to be someone there saying, actually, no, this is how you should be doing it. And actually working within an institution to try and reform that institution is valuable. The problem is when we see that as our solution. So if we approach Oxford University and try to decolonize Oxford University because we think that in doing that, Oxford University will be our savior, what we also participate in is the lack of recognition of where true liberation also comes from. The lack of decentering ourselves and looking at those who are most oppressed and have the most to give us in terms of leadership towards liberation. So yes, we should continue with these initiatives. We should do things, but without consciousness, we risk seeing ourselves as saviors.
And actually, speaking of consciousness, I wanted to ask you about that at a time where I was just watching a video actually this morning of Mo Gaudat, who is the former chief business exec of Google X, talking about this danger that we face when we live in a world where people are looking for answers to complex questions. They type it into ChatGPT and they get one answer, right? They get an answer, which is the answer. And Mo, raises this question from an ethical and a moral perspective. He says most questions do not have one answer.
Right.
There is not one truth.
Right.
And that's without going into, obviously, the risks of trusting ChatGPT, which is only as good as what's been inputted into the system, which we know has like a Western bias, a Cali tech bro bias, which is its own niche within that, right? So I wanted to ask you about kind of consciousness raising at a time where we are increasingly merging with the machine. How do we do that carefully, cautiously? We're trying to raise our consciousness, we're trying to learn more, but actually are the tools that are more and more available to us helping us, or could they be part of the problem?
I think all the tools are a problem. And this is part of the problem, is that even if we say, this AI is definitely, it's very narrow in its scope in terms of what it can provide us. And the problem is it has the illusion of being very wide in its scope because it seems to like trawl the entire internet and give you so much, right? And yeah, it's wrong half the time. Like, we do have to be careful using it anyway. But the same thing you can apply to universities as well, right? So like actually the answers that universities give us and the way in which we're presented those answers are also problematic. I think one of the solutions is reading, actually picking up books and reading.
Which, as you and I both know, is decreasing dramatically. The average reading age in the UK is of nine-year-old.
Wow, yeah.
That's average reading.
Yeah, reading is a liberatory exercise and it is tremendously freeing. And I think my radicalization journey has been all about books. Like, that's how it happened to me. So I think that's one thing. But the second is also being with each other. Like, I think part of the problem about banging on about consciousness and education when it comes to liberation is we ignore the different types of education and the different types of learning that can happen, right? So like, my grandparents didn't learn, my ancestors didn't learn in the way in which we consider learning, but they learned how to look after each other, and that was something. And in learning that, they realized what was a threat to them and what wasn't. And that is liberatory education, right? So like, we can become quite elitist, when we go into Marxist spaces and, you haven't read this theory and you don't understand that theory and what is material dialectics. And, that can become quite an elitist movement and can actually, we end up doing the oppression rather than fighting it,
Yeah, well, speaking of elitism, I wanted to ask you about Harvard and what's going on at Harvard. So obviously, many people will know that Harvard has essentially refused to abide by the Trump administration's demands now for many of the universities that had encampments on them. And they're now suing the federal government, which has now essentially said that they're going to freeze $2.2 billion in federal research funding. So universities obviously dependent on research funding. It's a big deal for Harvard. Now, they're getting praised for this, but obviously for people who aren't necessarily aware of like the American university scene, like Columbia kowtowed to the Trump administration demands, and it was like, yo, you want to send your ICE agents? We'll just let you know where the students are at. Columbia is typically thought of as like more liberal and left wing, and Harvard is tended to be thought of as more conservative and more aligned with the government. So how do you make sense of Harvard kind of refusing? I mean, on the face of it, the official line is to protect academic freedom. What do you make of that? What's actually going on? What's the tea, Hasanain?
I don't know. I don't know what the tea is around that. I do know that I have no trust or faith in Harvard as an institution. Like, it's a corporation. Essentially, it's there to make money, right? So whether this is a boardroom discussion that says actually positioning ourselves this way, we might take some of the money that Columbia is giving up now in taking this position and trying to position themselves in that way. These companies make bets. That's what they do. That's what they've always done, right? The reason we grew up seeing Facebook, Google as these left-wing companies that actually are really out there fighting for free speech, and then the moment Trump comes in and cancels DEI and everything, they all followed suit, right? Like, didn't Google remove Black History Month from its calendar? Remove Pride Week from its calendar? Like, it totally, it's almost as if it was unblocked, right? Like, suddenly they had permission to do this. Why? Because now that's what's in their interest, right? So, like, recognition that these institutions, which are just corporations, only work towards what's in their interest. But even if they did hypothetically, have a meeting and say, oh, actually, we need to protect free speech in this moment, and suddenly had some sort of magic moral moment, which I very much doubt. What have they done, really? Right? Like, if you were truly a moral institution, your primary thing wouldn't be, we're going to let everyone else speak. You would speak. You would be providing the opposition that is so desperately needed to the hegemonic narrative around Israel and Palestine. You would be calling it genocide. You would be welcoming Palestinian students through your door. Like, you don't deserve praise for saying, no, we won't shut them up.
Yeah, well, and they have actually done that, shutting up, because Harvard suspended its undergraduate Palestine Solidarity Committee in April 2024 in the middle of mass student protests on campus. And it's also suspended pro-Palestine students and pro-Palestine faculty have been sidelined or harassed. So on one hand, obviously, they're suing the Trump administration. On the other hand, I don't think it would be fair to say that Harvard's been kind of actively involved in resisting the US administration's participation and funding of the genocide in Gaza. Speaking of which, you've obviously been very vocal on what's been happening in Gaza over the last 18 months. I actually can't believe that this is where we're at. You and others have described Palestine as a settler colonial project. What makes Israel a settler colonial project, and why is it important for us to define it in those terms?
Okay, so it's important for us to define it in those terms because it helps us make the connections, right? Like, what Palestine has done, and I say this often, is I really feel like in some ways Palestine is freeing us, right? And that shouldn't be the impetus, and that doesn't justify anything, but it is saying that actually what's happening in Palestine has opened our eyes up to these connections. Because Israel is a colony, essentially, right? So we mentioned before about how in the 50s, 60s, when this decolonization was happening, there was a crisis moment for capitalism, right? Because the way capitalism operates is it relies on these inputs that come from the periphery to the imperial core, right? This is how we all prosper. Those inputs need to get progressively cheaper and cheaper to enable the growth of wealth, which is what capitalism relies upon, right? So this growth imperative means that when decolonization was happening in the formal sense of decolonization, when these states were becoming independent, those that were resisting the movement of wealth from the periphery to the imperial core were a problem for the imperial core. And so suppression had to happen in some way. Some of that happened through debt and structural adjustments through the IMF, through the World Bank, through the United Nations. Some of it happened through assassinations. We know that the CIA had huge list of assassinations that happened in African countries, for example. And some of it happened through colonial outposts, through military bases, right? So an example of that is South Africa. Israel forms part of that, because when the Zionist project came to the imperial court to ask permission to have a state, there was a great opportunity, one, to get rid of the Jews. This is explicitly what was intentioned by the British. It was an anti-Semitic act to begin with, the establishment of a Zionist state. But the second is the opportunity to have a highly militarized colonial outpost in the Middle East, North Africa region, which can then be used as a platform to suppress leaders in the area, to sow discord and keep nation states in that area spending on defense rather than on infrastructure, to ensure the continued reliance on the imperial core.
Yeah. So to that point, if we recognize Israel to be, one of the last existing formal settler colonial projects, and I say formal in the sense that we can find a continuity between, the British mandate in Palestine, giving people, giving essentially Westerners in this case, land and other people's land, and sort of assuming that they can do that. That's a very colonial act in and of itself. Are you then saying that, the slogan "Free Palestine" is actually part of a wider anti-colonial struggle? And so what is the end goal of an anti-colonial struggle except complete freedom from the colonizers?
If Palestine were to be truly free, it would actually mean it would unravel a lot more than just that region or just that nation state. Can
you elaborate on that for people who may not understand why Palestine would unravel so many other things?
So this system of racial capitalism, which basically has created a hierarchy in the world of races, of nation states, which has created an imperial core, which is essentially what we think of as Western countries or as the global North, and requires constant growth and prosperity within those countries, which in turn requires the constant exploitation of the global South for their natural resources, for labor, which we saw through slavery, but now we see through cheap wages, etc., right? And which requires the constant flow of that wealth from those peripheral countries, from the global South to the global North. So in order for that to be upheld, what it requires is our continued participation within that, right? So think about Nazism for a minute. When Nazi Germany, when Hitler was in power, what he was doing is using the same logic of racial capitalism that was established in our universities here in the West, right? Like the idea that certain people with certain phenotypical features are worth less, right? And are dispensable, essentially. And he used that against the Jewish community.
Right. So this is the race science that was very popular at the time and had been used to justify colonization and the
slavery,
subjugation and enslavement and massacres, in fact, of people deemed to be inferior peoples.
But it had to be cut out. The Western powers had to intervene because it threatened the participation of consumers. That's what we are in the Western world, because the narrative was no longer one that could be justified.
Why not?
Because the victims looked too white and because it was too close to home. So and that's an oversimplification, and there's a lot more to that, and there's a lot more to be talked about in terms of the expansion and contraction of whiteness and where Jewish people fit into that picture.
Yeah.
But the point is that when participation from us is threatened, we could bring down the system, because the moment we stop acting as economic units, the moment we look to each other and say, do we need this system to look after each other, then we threaten the core of the capitalist project. And this is what's happening with Palestine. Is the problem with Palestine is that the narrative is unraveling. The problem that the capitalist core has is that the narrative is unraveling. So the unraveling of that narrative, Palestine becoming truly free, threatens the participation of the people that need to participate to hold the system up. And it's the house of cards. It's us.
Which is us. We are the key to upholding and maintaining the system.
But we are not the key to liberation. Because, and I think this is where we often see ourselves as the key to everything, because we think of ourselves as the most educated, the most privileged, and the most able to bring down the system, as if we can see something that no one else can see. But us, middle-class Westerners whose needs are looked after, what we can be doing is strangling the system from the core, which is essentially to try and imagine ways of being in society that don't rely on the capitalist structure. I know this sounds wild and it sounds out there, but actually it's a house of cards.
Well, I suppose it doesn't sound so well, but one of the questions I have on that idea that, so I completely hear the idea that liberation movements should be led by the people on the front lines of that movement, right? They're the people who understand the parameters of that movement most clearly and should be leading on what the terms of liberation should look like. But when those people are, being starved, bombed, obliterated, when their day-to-day involves like just trying to survive, do we not have another function at this time? Because that's like, doesn't that seem like an additional burden that we're placing on them? It's like, while you're being exterminated, could you also tell us what you'd like us to be doing? I don't know. That feels like a lot to be asking at this point.
I don't think you're wrong in that there is something about survival, right? Like, so even when all of this started, I kept saying that actually what we have to do first is get a ceasefire to happen, because literally kids are dying, right? Like there's no other imperative to move right now apart from stopping this madness, right? Stopping this bloodshed. And there is this problem. But I think for us the assumption we make as people in the imperial core is problematic, because we have been the problem for far too long, and the solutions we look for are often solutions that can come about without sacrifice for us.
Can we stay comfortable? Can we still have our lattes?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is the problem, right? Is that we can't just suddenly become part of the solution. We need to go on a journey which includes reimagining outside of this system, actually practicing living outside of this system, because that journey automatically begins to break down the system from the core. And it is happening. There is a shift in narrative occurring in the Western world. And I wouldn't quite say we're at a revolution stage yet, but I think about the whole Blue Origin thing that just,
right,
the spaceship that went up, and Katy Perry's whole video. I found it, I don't know, I mean, it was entertainment, right? I found it funny. Like,
isn't that its purpose?
Wow. But the backlash and the fact that it caught her by surprise, and the fact that this whole narrative of, yes, I can be hippy dippy and take a daisy up to space and bring it down and kiss the earth, as if I care at all about the earth, without making the connection between the massive exploitation and extraction, not only that flight, but Jeff Bezos represents and Amazon represents. Like, the fact that she thought somehow she could get away with that and didn't on this occasion, I think something is shifting. I think there is an unraveling happening here. And I think Palestine has a lot to do with it.
Palestine has a lot to do with it. I also think that Gen Z, to their credit, are wide awake when it comes to the future they and their children will face if there is not drastic action. I think forget boomers, but even us millennials, we still see kind of the climate emergency as something that, probably won't fully hit us in our lifetime. I mean, it's hitting us hard, but what I mean is Gen Zers are like facing extermination down, like, right? It's not a joke, it's actual reality. And so I feel like that because of that, there's a radicalization happening, because they can see the disconnect increasingly. And, there are platforms trying to help create connections for them in that regard. Yeah. The Tea is a fully independent, non-partisan production. No corporate ties here, just a small, dedicated team working hard to bring you honest, impactful conversations. If you believe in our work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click on that subscribe button now and join us as a Patreon. You'll find the link in our bio. I want to ask you about, like, you talk a lot about community and, building communities outside of the current system as a way of sort of supporting a wider liberation movement. Where do our friendships sit within that? And I want to ask specifically about friendships across political lines, and particularly across the Israel-Palestine line. So I have friends, and I still consider them friends, that I have not spoken to for 18 months. And I have very mixed emotions about that. I'm not even saying I'm right. Don't follow my example. I just haven't. And I don't know whether that is the right thing to do, because I know that we're not going to agree, and therefore we may just fall out. Or am I just contributing to the wider issue of polarization that we know is a real problem in our society, where it's like, even if we disagree fundamentally on things, we should still be able to see humanity in the other, right? Is there something that we should be able to see beyond those lines?
I don't know. I mean, it's a really difficult thing, right? I can give a theoretical answer in that actually I feel like what happens with most people who are trying to survive in our society today are oppressed in some way, are not truly free, right? And actually, we have all bought into this system in some way. And so, we're not thinking straight almost, right? So, like, I can see this argument for compassion and forgiveness. But the reality is, I would find it very difficult to continue being in relationship with somebody who, even in this moment, cannot see what is happening in the world, like who cannot call it a genocide, who cannot see what Israel is doing as totally abhorrent. Like, to me, there's something very natural about saying, I cannot be around you right now because I am watching children being blown up. I am watching, they bombed a bulldozer, like that was used to extract bodies from the rubble. Like, I'm watching these images on my TV, and then you're coming in saying, but Israel might have a point. Like,
Yeah, but what about us? I don't know. I'm really on the fence about it. We both are Muslims as people of faith. I think almost regardless of faith, there's always this encouragement to not allow like our hatred or our anger towards the injustice cloud how we feel about individual people, right? And I think personally that's been like a very deep spiritual challenge for me over the last 18 months, is like I have so much anger.
But there's also power imbalance here, right? Is that the people who are taking on this position and who are holding on to that position also have the hegemonic narrative behind them. They have the power of the media behind them. They have political power behind them. And so that opens the door to more, there's a justification to say, actually, what you're doing in a private space, if you're pro-Palestinian, if you're pro-Zionist, is violence. It's a form of violence because you are bringing in all that power that's behind you, and you are using it not to listen but to crush another narrative. If there is, people who are not sure and they're listening, I think that's an entirely different conversation.
Right. I think there's a growing number of people who sort of are a bit more, I'm going to say, in the sort of two sides world of like, we don't agree with what Israel's doing and we think Netanyahu, and they usually specifically pick out Netanyahu as being a problem, but also, what about us?
The problem, even in this conversation, what we're doing is we're looking at it in our context, right? Like, and when we zoom out and look at it in a more global way, there's a very different picture out there. And actually that journey happened a while back, which is what I mean when I say we can't lead the liberation because we have too much to unlearn, right? Like, we're still figuring out how to view this without seeing with unpeeling the racial dynamics that play into it. Like, the friends of ours who are pro-Zionist are unlearning white supremacy, whilst in Jordan, in Yemen, like, they are out there on the streets because they see it for what it is already. They always have, right? They're so much further along that journey.
So speaking of which, so there are a couple of mantras which have become highly popular over the course of the last 18 months. Self-care is resistance. Joy is an act of resistance. I've used it myself. We hear a lot of these terms being used. Obviously, they were coined in many cases by African American women who were, facing their own discrimination and civil rights struggles. Do you see a place for that terminology in our current, time and in this particular struggle? Or do you see that as part of the sort of capitalist co-optation of previous struggles and their sort of sanitization? Because obviously some of these do involve people just posting pictures of them in a bubble bath.
And I struggle with it, to be honest with you. I struggle with that sort of language. I struggle with the idea that somehow we have got to center ourselves so much so that, yes, going to a spa or going on holiday is somehow an act of resistance. But I say that with certain caveats. Like, The first is to recognize that there is no actual such thing as self-care, right? So if I tell you I'm having a self-care day today and I go to the supermarket and buy myself some chocolate, like, I am not thinking about the workers in that supermarket, the production process of that chocolate, or where that chocolate has been picked, or which part of the global south has been exploited for me to have that chocolate, right? Like, and there's a really simple example. So everything is connected in such a way that self-care doesn't exist. And actually, joy being resistance, rest being resistance are important concepts, but only within a certain, after we've achieved a certain level of consciousness. Like, communal care is resistance, right? Taking joy in each other is a form of resistance, but not capitalist joy. Celebrating somebody because they've got a promotion at work is not the type of joy is resistance that we need, right? So like, I think when we have consciousness, when we can recognize the connections between our body and land and resistance, then we can recognize that it is an act of resistance to look after our bodies, because the capitalist structure takes that away from us, right? Because they want us only to function with our bodies in a way that is either productive or consuming, right? So when we're looking after our own bodies, that is an act of resistance. But that sort of resistance is conscious, is recognizing I'm going to have this moment of joy. I'm going to look after myself and I'm going to look after the people around me, and I'm going to do it outside of a capitalist structure. But this is what our ancestors have been doing for generations, right? It's not new, and it's certainly nothing to do with going to a spa.
It's just been resold to us in the sort of capitalist narrative that makes it something that you have to pay for, as opposed to something that you can just grasp by climbing up a mountain with someone that you love, right?
Exactly.
But I definitely have to say that I struggled to know where and how to experience joy over the last 18 months, that it affected me. And, you know, without kind of making it a sob story, but it's like, it's very difficult to maintain your struggle and maintain your place within a movement in providing maybe encouragement to people, providing suggestions on what things could be done, organizing if you yourself are feeling mentally distorted by what's been happening, right? I don't know how many months of watching people in bits, children in pieces you can have without it sort of, I think at some profound level, changing you. And the lack of joy was something that I observed as negatively impacting my ability to get back out, to be honest. I recognized that it was making me more reclusive, it was making me more sullen, and it was robbing me of an energy, personally, that I know is necessary right now. And so I'm just wondering, you know, when we are, as you say, we're distant from it, we have the privilege of stepping away from it, but we are still really affected by it. How do we balance that effect without participating in actually the very system that is supporting the ongoing genocide? I mean, apart from boycott, divest, and sanction, which we all know is one of the big routes.
I mean, it is unnatural, right? Like, to be witnessing genocide, and especially in the way we're witnessing it, is unnatural. Like, we have access to multiple angles from multiple cameras all the time, and we're looking at like oppression, which, you know, we don't want anybody to be witnessing, we don't want anybody to be experiencing, but we're doing it multiple times a day,
sometimes first thing in the morning.
Yeah, like literally, it's really hard to know how to be with that.
Yeah.
Like, how to witness that and be normal and actually function normally. I don't have the answer, because it shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't have to have the answer for this. But what it has done for me is it has made me view my own life in a different way. Like, I have privilege, but I have spent the last 18 months recognizing the guilt that comes with that privilege, right? Like, and I don't mean this in a centering way, like somehow my guilt is equivalent to genocide. But what I do mean is that if we turn it off and continue to operate the way we normally operate, continue to turn to comfort in the way we normally turn to comfort, or we did before we had this level of realization and consciousness, then we continue to be part of the problem. I think we do have to go through the pain of recognizing that we are part of the problem. And in doing that, we recognize that, yes, boycott's great, but if we're just swapping out Starbucks for Tim Hortons, like, we haven't done the job. Like, what we really need to be doing is recognizing what it means for us to be able to go and buy coffee in coffee cups, and what we need to change to do this in a different way.
I wanted to ask you about Frantz Fanon, who is one of my favorite intellectuals, French Martinican psychiatrist who was a key figure in the Algerian liberation struggle. And he's written extensively about violence, and often that's one of the things that he's critiqued for, actually. But what I always understood Fanon was saying was that the colonized learned the language of violence from the colonizers, right? They taught the colonizers the language in which to communicate through their violence. And I was thinking about this a lot in the context of just the sheer amount of violence that we were just talking about today, which for some reason does not conjure in at least in legacy media and in mainstream sort of political spaces, the same emotional response as, say, the Nova Festival attack. And I just wanted to ask, why is it that there are some forms of violence that seem to be acceptable to us, and other forms which are just seen to be so morally abhorrent? Like, it's almost a sort of meaningless statement to say we all hate violence. It's obvious. No one actually wants violence, but there is violence everywhere, and the US is the most violent purveyor of violence in the world. So why is some violence seen as okay and we have to tolerate it, and it's just the cost of Israel's security, and other forms of violence is, when it's resisting an occupation, barbaric and backwards and terrorism?
Because this is the racial contract we've signed, right? Because we have been living in a world which has, for centuries now, taught us that violence is acceptable when it's perpetrated by certain individuals on certain individuals, right? Like,
where did we learn this? How did we learn that?
We learned that because we allowed the very universities that we're talking about to develop these philosophies and sciences. You know, it's like the same philosophers that we still quote today, Kant, Hume, like all these Enlightenment philosophers had very clear ideas about the non-humanness of Black people, for example, that enabled enslavement to happen. And these ideas are not just theoretical ideas, like they have filtered through into our psyche, through our education systems, through our state institutions and policies that we have, right? And yes, we have made progress in changing these formal definitions and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. But the reality is that even now, when we look at soldiers who fight for the British Army or for the US Army, we do not see them in the same light as we see somebody who fought for Al-Qaeda, or for, even though they have both perpetrated violence, even though we might not agree with war that the British government undertakes, we still somehow justify in our minds the violence that that person has undertaken. And it is because they represent whiteness and they do not represent whiteness. You know, there is a very clear demarcation of who is allowed to be violent and who is not allowed to be violent, and who it's okay to be a victim of violence and who it's not okay to be a victim of violence. I mean, the example, you know, when Ukraine happened, when Russia invaded Ukraine, to me, the stark difference, at the time I was working for Sponsor Refugee, and we were trying to get families in the UK, to get institutions to sponsor families from Syria. And it was really hard. You know, we got 19 or 20 families. We were really happy that we were getting them into the country. And then Ukraine happened and the doors just opened. Suddenly everybody wanted to use their spare room to take in a refugee, right? Like, there's very clear, because they're not allowed to be victims. White people are not allowed to be the victims of violence like this. Syria, Iraq, the Middle East, it just doesn't matter as much to us. Like, we've swallowed these narratives, and to unlearn them is a difficult process, and also a criminalized process. You're not allowed to talk about terrorist institutions like they're not terrorists. It's criminalized.
Right.
So these laws still exist today to uphold this narrative.
Yeah,
right?
not to mention obviously all the Captain America and all these various other films that remind us that the American Empire is out to save the world.
Although somehow in fictional media we do find examples like Star Wars, where you have the example of resistance, or the Hunger Games.
Yeah.
You have the example of resistance fight, and you're actually on side with them. But yes, you're right. Like the hegemonic narrative, the narrative that constantly comes through this: thank you for your service. The standing up at basketball games for the veterans that walk through the door. The standing up for the national anthem, because somehow this continuous affiliation between nation states, morality, goodness, and even extends to the violence that they then perpetrate.
Speaking of standing for the US national anthem, there's obviously been a notable increase in solidarity with Palestine over the last 18 months for I think probably very obvious reasons. A recent poll in the UK found that more than half of Britain's young people do not believe that Israel should exist. Do you think that the current wave of support for Palestine in the UK would have been as prominent without the groundwork laid by BLM? What did the BLM, the Black Lives Matter struggle, the protests that we saw all around the world, what kind of foundational work did it lay, do you think, if any, to allow maybe many more people racialized as white in this country to take a stand on something that maybe previously they would have thought was outside of their ability to speak or to protest on or participate in the resistance to?
I think it's an interesting question. I think that BLM movement overall had limited impact, like especially when you carry it through to today. Actually, I think I think one of the indicators of that was that it was co-opted. Again, the government took it on. In America, the liberals bought it wholesale. Corporations were posting BLM. Yeah, exactly. So, like, I think overall, it was crushed in a very Western fashion, and it had limited impact overall. But it had a very radical roots, and in fact, the evidence of that is even today the position that BLM have taken on Palestine has been massively radical, and the BLM movement, I think, brought a whole new cohort of people to a certain level of consciousness, and this is what happens with these movements, is that there's a big wave of recruitment and people join these movements. It happened with climate change as well. It happened with BLM. It's happening again with Palestine. And there tends to be these waves where people are brought in, and so BLM plays a role, like all these movements play a role. But Palestine has been happening for decades now. And globally, there has always been a very strong Palestine solidarity movement, or at least a Palestine solidarity sentiment. The problem is that we have not been, at least in our context, organized enough to actually have an impact when it mattered, right? Like, we have to recognize this. The fact that, this has been happening for 18 months, and for all our talk about how many people are against it and how big the movement has become and how powerful it is, we didn't manage to get a ceasefire, right? Like, we didn't manage to get them to stop that destruction. And I'm talking about us at the core of empire.
Right.
Like, this is a real moment of reckoning. We don't have that power. We don't have that. It's limited. There's no point to patting ourselves on the back for having done a protest, or for Tesla shares falling, if we can't stop the
direct violence.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder about this in the context of the UK in particular, because not saying that France has succeeded in bringing about a ceasefire either, but I do feel that protests in France, which is obviously where I'm from originally, are when people protest in France, there is almost inherent within the protest an understanding that the state should fear us. The people. Yeah. The state should fear us. Like, I know obviously from abroad, no one wants to see burning cars and all the rest of it. But there's also inherent within that a threat of, if you mess with our pensions, we will burn your cars.
Yeah.
We will, take down the police.
And I think this is what Frantz Fanon talks about. Like, violence is the language of the colonizer, the only language that the colonizer understands. But I think more than that is that this recognition is helpful. The moment is helpful for us to recognize that our lack of power means we have got to respond by building power. And actually, the burning cars, the protesting, the shouty actions that we're doing are helpful, but they're not. They don't get to the core of the matter.
Well, they're not scared of us. Clearly, those in power are not scared of the people. And to go back to your social contract idea, which, obviously you were mentioning the racial contract, but there is also a democratic contract, right? Our taxes pay their wages. Our taxes pay their bills. How is it that we could be, so many of us for so long out in the streets being unequivocal about this issue, and we're not being listened to?
Democracy as an idea, as a concept, is a great idea because it brings power back to the people. In practice, we don't live in a democratic state. None of the states that we're talking about, the US, Canada, UK, these are not democratic states because democracy stops at the borders of the economy. And that's the problem, is that the means of production, where wealth goes and how it travels, is not in the hands of the people in general. It is in the hands of the oligarchy. It's in the hand of select few billionaires. That is the opposite of democracy. Having a vote once every 4 years does not make you democratic.
And it's so interesting because I actually think that shift has not been fully acknowledged by either governments or us as individuals, which is that actually, as you say, the real corporations, the wealth producers in terms of the organizations producing huge amounts of wealth, are now supranational. Right? They don't respond to the rules of an individual country. I mean, they'll have their HQ often somewhere where they can avoid tax. But in general, they are supranational, and they have often profits that go far beyond that of national GDPs of many countries. So I do wonder whether we need to have a rethink of what democracy looks like in this new era of extreme concentration of wealth and power in the hands of so few, and how we resist that. I want to ask you about the post 9/11 climate and the ways in which it has created the state of exceptionalism that we are now seeing being used against various figures in the Palestine movement. But I would say even beyond the Palestine movement, we're seeing, environmental activists arrested on terrorism charges. Like, a lot of the groundwork for where we are today feels to me, as a Muslim who's lived through that era, as having been laid in the decades that have preceded us. So is that a connection that you see? And how would you say the post 9/11 era and the terrorism legislation that's been brought in, etc., has created the basis for where we are today in terms of suppression, the removal of certain rights and the criminalization of protest?
So I think 9/11 was a very significant turning point because they made it a significant turning point. Like, it would be a mistake to imagine it as the origins of securitization of Muslims or Islamophobia in any way. It was utilized very, very effectively by Western nation states as an excuse to increase that securitization. But yes, with major geopolitical incentives attached to it in terms of how do we control the Middle East, North Africa region. Remember, we talked about this participation that's always required in the imperial core. As long as your narratives dehumanize people, you're okay to exploit them. This is essentially what we're talking about. Like, we know, for example, I mean, we all watch Blood Diamond, or we all know that the minerals from our phones come from African countries and that children are used to mine those minerals, right? Like, that is mind-blowing. If you think about it for a minute, if that was happening down the road in East London or something, like, nobody would buy phones. But it is happening. It's happening, and we all buy smartphones, right? So, like, there is this question we have to ask here is, where did we get to this point where we allowed our morals to be dictated by the color of the skin, or at least our perception of the person who's being oppressed? So 9/11, I think, and the post 9/11 policy changes are just a tweak, an expression of that has continued and that has allowed Western governments to suppress the Islamic communities in the UK, but also to keep the oppression in the Middle East, North Africa region going. And it set the stage of the justification for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and, so like in Libya. So all of that is, I think, part of that picture.
The other sort of key question I have for you is around liberalism and a way, and this sort of ideology of liberalism that for a very long time now, at least throughout my lifetime, has been presented as a almost the litmus test of your social acceptability, right? So if you are old enough to remember when David Cameron was prime minister, then you'll be reminded that we were being told as Muslims that state multiculturalism had failed and that muscular liberalism was required to teach the barbarians about what's good and right and acceptable and what it means to be British. But we're also now, like however many years later, at a time where the liberal consensus seems to be disintegrating. We have increasing conservative opinions throughout the world. I mean, the US has now, is it 11 states where abortion is now illegal? We're seeing the removal of the rights of various minority groups. We're seeing a real rollback on fundamental rights. Even in this country, we saw Keir Starmer, who is not just the prime minister, but the head of the Labour Party, roll back trans women's rights and taking a view that was kind of diametrically opposed to his own views just a few years ago. So what has happened to the liberal consensus? And do you connect the sort of disenchantment with liberalism to the fall of empire? Or are we just seeing the swing of the pendulum? You know how it goes. Yeah. Liberal for a bit, push back against that, and then we'll go back to, I mean, how do you interpret it?
I guess I think of liberalism as has always been sort of a controlled opposition, right? Like the idea of multiculturalism, muscular liberalism, the idea of accepting, it's always had its limitations because it only applies as long as it doesn't impact the continued growth of capital. I know I keep banging on about this, but I think the underlying incentives have always been economic, right? Even multiculturalism was really about assimilation and integration. Muscular liberalism is also about assimilation and integration, but it's about how do we make these people either mega productive or allow us to continue exploiting you, right, for a capitalist economy. And so there is a swing of the pendulum in as far as long as we're allowed to, we will get away with policies that can do that in an unbridled way. And when the sentiment requires it, then we will have controlled opposition in the form of liberal policies. And I think that's just, in a very oversimplified way, how the world has functioned. But there are signs, I think, of actually narratives unraveling. And one of the big things right now is Trump, right? And to me, I don't want to say, like, I want to acknowledge, first of all, that there is a harm in Trump being in power is very harmful for trans people, people of color in America, for people whose resident status is questionable, like,
or not.
Yeah, or not at the moment. Yeah. So like there is massive harm being inflicted there. And yet at the same time, I want to recognize that that harm is still relative and is at the core of empire compared to the sharp end of what we're seeing in Palestine, for example. And so there is an opportunity in this moment that we have to acknowledge, which is that Trump being in power and the global impact that he's having is exposing whiteness in a way that is whiteness is allergic to, because whiteness operates and is predicated on absence and on being hidden. And actually his actions now are exposing them, which gives us the opportunity to then utilize that to raise consciousness.
And what do you mean by whiteness, just for people who are listening in and who might not be familiar with that term?
How long do you have? By whiteness, I mean the global structure of white supremacy, but especially the way in which it operates in society and the way as a culture, the way in which it operates in society.
Now, as my last question to you, Hasanain, I want to ask you about, a lot of people come to you, I'm sure, on social media to kind of get a sense of the direction of where they should put their energies in resisting this current juncture that we're at, whether it's Palestine or other issues. What is, firstly, the role of the Global South in our current juncture of sort of resisting empire and the policies of empire, but without maybe over idealizing the Global South? Because I do find that we fall into a bit of a binary sometimes when it's like, okay, we're anti-empire, so now we're like maybe a little bit pro-China, definitely pro-BRICS. And I look at those countries and I obviously, Global South, we want to see them gain autonomy and independence, but also is China the solution? I'm not asking you that specifically, but more generally, how do we support the movement, the emancipatory movement that we hope will bring about the ceasefire and freedom in Palestine, but also seems to be part of a wider movement of a recalibration of power between different global powers in our international community, without, I think, wearing rose-tinted goggles about some of the countries that we are looking at to save us?
I mean, I'm an anarchist. So the first thing I'd say is that the nation state as a structure is part of the problem, right? So like, I don't look to any country and think this is our solution or this is some haven or this is what we should all be like. I do think that it's not so much the global south countries, but the people who are at the front line of oppression have answers for us that we might not have. But honestly, Myriam, I think for us, our primary concern should be waking up every morning and asking ourselves our role in this, right? Like, and what are we doing? How are we part of the problem? Learning how we're part of the problem better, and learning how we stop being part of the problem. So if you were to ask me that what we should be focusing on, it's almost to say, don't worry about forming judgments on the action of China. I mean, you can if you want to and if you're interested, but it's theoretical and it's academic. And actually, what we need to be doing is recognizing how we are part of the problem here right now. And it's difficult because it doesn't match the urgency of what we're seeing happen in Palestine. But when we recognize that what is happening in Palestine now is partly due to our inaction yesterday, then we have to act today to make sure there isn't another Palestine tomorrow. And so raising our own consciousness, reading, understanding what's happening, building community by accessing the most vulnerable, by accessing the homeless, by looking after the disabled people in our community and practicing mutual aid, and building our power through that community, and divestment. So understanding our role in the capitalist structure and working to reimagine how we act in community outside of that structure. Those are the three things I think we have to be focusing on.
Hasanain, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely.
Thank you for being with us. I hope this conversation has left you with something to carry, question, reflections, maybe even a little discomfort. Here at The Tea, we are committed to holding space for the voices and stories that too often get pushed to the margins. If that feels important to you too, you can support this work by subscribing, sharing this episode, or joining us on Patreon. Until next time, stay awake, stay questioning, and keep the conversation alive in the comments below. Thanks for watching The Tea. Please remember to like and subscribe. And if you've made it this far, why not keep going and check out this episode?